following are time-slip stories where ordinary people leading ordinary lives are suddenly transported into another time, dimension, or reality, where everything they believed in up to that point in their life is completely challenged and their life would never be the same. Lee Dean, Kentucky. On March 15, 2011 at 3:15 p.m, Lee decided to check inside the old law office building, where his family had once practiced law, but was now empty. He decided to check the building for damage because he'd heard that a nearby factory had been doing some blasting a few months earlier and was checking to see if the building had been damaged in any way. The building was very old and dated back to pre-Civil War. He entered through the back door and then headed upstairs. He first entered his mother's old room, then into his old office. No damage. And then checked his brother's old room. Still no damage. The last room was the library, and found it was badly damaged. The ceiling had collapsed and the wood was exposed, but fortunately no water damage. He then went downstairs to check the kitchen. That was okay, and then walked up into the secretary's room and then his late father's old office. Both were okay. As he entered the waiting room, he found there was a lot of damage to the walls where the plaster had fallen away. Again, the wood was exposed, but no water damage. He then went home and called the neighbour that did house repairs. Then Lee and his neighbour went back to the old law office to assess the damage. They walked through the building in the same order that Lee had previously checked. To their surprise, there was no damage whatsoever. He was totally dismayed. He knew what he'd seen a few hours earlier, and he told his neighbour that his only explanation was that he had somehow walked into the past. He remembered that there had been wall damage back in 1969, where they had to replaster all the walls. He believed that he'd walked back into the building as it was in 1969, 50 years previously. He tried to figure out what had just happened. Maybe it was just residual energy, but he was certain that he had checked all the rooms twice, and some of them were damaged, and the event had somehow left an imprint. Obviously, the factory blasting had nothing to do with the damage, because the damage was from natural wear and tear, and from a different time, half a century ago. Henderson. Henderson was driving down a dirt road, and had become lost, when all of a sudden, an old 1940s vintage car flew past him at high speed. There was a sharp curve up ahead, and due to the car's speed, it failed to take the turn and shot off into a field of kudzu. He was less than 250 feet from the car when it left the road, and Henderson thought, wow, some fool has just wrecked a classic car. He got out of the car to check on the accident and initially had trouble trying to locate it amongst the wild kudzu. Then all of a sudden, he came upon the car and found that it was completely rusted. The tyres had perished and they were hanging in pieces, and the kudzu had grown all over the rusted out body. The car had aged 50 years in about 20 seconds. He had somehow seen a car wreck 50 years after it had happened. He quickly jumped back into his car and left in a panic. Frank Fresh, New Jersey. In 2014, Frank's 17-year-old son and 19-year-old daughter were living in Fairfield, New Jersey, with their mother. Frank and his wife had separated, and Frank now lived in Lyndhurst, New Jersey, about 40 miles away. One day his son and daughter jumped into their 2002 Jeep Grand Cherokee and decided to visit their father, a trip they had taken on many occasions. On this particular trip, his kids swore they had not touched a drop of alcohol or taken any drugs, and his daughter did not believe in the paranormal. As they exited Route 21 around 5:30 p.m, which at the time was rush hour, they waited to make a left to cross the Nutley-Lyndhurst Bridge. As the lights turned green, they turned and found they were now heading west towards the bridge. As soon as the Jeep's front tyres had hit the metal grating on the bridge, in an instant they suddenly realised they were now heading in the complete opposite direction, east, which was about 3 blocks away from the bridge in Nutley. They both looked at each other, and in a panic, he just slammed on the brakes in the middle of the two-lane traffic, causing the traffic behind them to beep their horns in anger. Totally bewildered, they pulled the car over into the nearest parking lot next to a small park. At the same time, they just looked at each other and screamed. What the hell just happened? They realized that in a split second, they were somehow transported a few blocks away in the opposite direction. They then jumped out of the car totally confused. After managing to compose themselves, they continued their journey to their father's. They knew he would believe their story because he was into the paranormal. On arriving at their father's house, they blurted out their amazing experience, where Frank claimed that, judging by the looks on their faces, they were both horrified and frightened. Frank also felt a bit jealous of their experience because he was the one who believed in the paranormal. His daughter distinctly said to him that she cannot believe this happened to her because she's never believed in that kind of stuff until now. They immediately returned to the spot and tried to recreate exactly what had happened, where Frank was hoping to relive their experience, but nothing happened. When they got back to Frank's, they quickly Googled about the bridge at Nutley to see if anyone else had experienced something strange there, but there was nothing. Frank was hoping that someone reading this blog might have happened to see a white Jeep Cherokee disappear in front of their eyes one summer day in 2014. Glenn, Oklahoma. Glenn became interested in time slips after the following bizarre event happened to him in 2007. He had just left Duncan, Oklahoma, headed for Comanche, Oklahoma, and decided to take some back roads to Comanche through Empire, Oklahoma. As he was driving, he could see a thunderstorm was approaching and thought he'd better get home quickly. As he drove onto Empire Road, he suddenly found that it was no longer paved, but was now a gravelly dirt road. He figured he'd suddenly made a wrong turn and continued driving along the dirt road. As he was travelling along the road, he noticed a gas station that he'd never seen before. It had old gas pumps that looked as if from the 1950s, and there were old hubcaps hanging on the walls of the gas station. Nearby were some mobile homes that looked old-fashioned as if from the 1970s. As he looked around, he also noticed the vehicles that were parked in front of the mobile homes. They looked like they were from the 1960s or 70s, and they were in mint condition. Although he was fascinated at what he was seeing, it was almost dark, and he felt he needed to get home quickly before the storm hit. Suddenly, the weather appeared to ease slightly as he continued to drive on the dirt road that he thought was Empire Road. As he drove, the road appeared to go on endlessly, and he was feeling uneasy because nothing around him was in the slightest bit familiar. He turned down another road, hoping to get back onto a paved road, or at least into familiar surroundings. But all he could see was more dirt roads, and those old-fashioned mobile homes. He then headed back to the gas station with the old gas pumps and the old hubcaps hanging on the wall. He had not seen old hubcaps like that since he was a kid. He then spotted an old Coke machine that was full of glass bottles and not cans. Although everything was lit up, it was very quiet. There was nobody around. There was also an old 1950s light blue pickup truck parked out front. As he continued down the road, he figured that, by the types of cars and houses he was observing, it appeared to be sometime in the 1970s. He continued driving down different dirt roads to try and find a way out of the maze, and he continued driving for what seemed an hour. He then stopped his car and just sat there for a while, totally frustrated, and thought he'd try and give it one more go. He looked up ahead and could just see where the gravel road turned into a paved road. He drove on, and once his eyes hit the paved road, the storm suddenly returned. And as he looked behind him, he noticed the mobile homes had disappeared. It was now raining, and he was anxious to find Highway 81 and get back home. He finally reached the highway and hurried home. A few days later, and with clearer weather, he decided to head back down Empire Road to try and locate the dirt road, the service station, old cars, and mobile homes. When he finally reached Empire Road, he found it was all paved and could not find any dirt roads. He tried to locate the old gas station, but it was not there. However, he did come across an empty field with bits of old concrete that would once have been the foundation for the service station. He was now scratching his head trying to figure out whether he had driven down the wrong road or whether it was the right road but at the wrong time. Empire Road as it was in the 1970s. Even the mobile homes were gone, where some had been replaced with newer homes. He decided to ask around about Empire Road and when it was last a dirt road, and they said it was paved back in the 1980s. He asked about the old gas station, and an old-timer told him that there was a gas station there, but it was torn down in 1987. The last time it was a service station was in 1981. As with many time slips that people experience, there is never anyone around, and there was always a deathly silence. If you're enjoying this video, don't forget to hit like. It really helps to keep the channel growing. And if you're new here, subscribe and tap the bell icon so you never miss our latest videos. We've got lots of strange and fascinating stories coming up, and we'd love to have you along for the journey. The ski party. The following unusual event happened to several staff members and their families of both the British and American embassies in Oslo in Norway. It was the spring of 1950 where they were all together in a ski party in a valley near the Oslo fjord. The story was recalled by Brigadier K. Tresida from the British Embassy. The party was skiing in near perfect conditions with fine weather and excellent snow conditions on land that was attached to an old farmhouse at the bottom of the valley. After the group of skiers had finished for the day and night was drawing in, the party was slowly making their way back to the car park, which was located about 183 metres from the farmhouse. The road to the car park was very straight, with good views of at least half a kilometre in either direction, as the light was still quite good, so if anyone was approaching the party, they would have easily been seen from all directions. The first of the skiers to reach the car park were the Brigadier and an American colleague, who upon arriving at their cars immediately started to remove their ski equipment. It was at this point that they were suddenly accosted by a lady with a strong Scottish accent who demanded to know why they'd been skiing on her land. The woman was described as being tall and elderly and was dressed in what could only be described as old-fashioned. Her suit appeared to be made from herringbone tweed, with a long skirt and a Norfolk jacket, which is a loose-belted, single-breasted tweed jacket with box pleats on the back and front, which were popular from the 1870s to the 1930s. She wore lace-up boots and a flat round cap. The woman was extremely angry, especially after the Brigadier admitted that yes, they had been skiing over the land, which the woman claimed was her land. At this stage, the Brigadier's wife had joined them, where the three of them were now being thoroughly chastised, where she regarded them as trespassers and ordered them off her land and never return. By now the party was totally bewildered, as they believed that in Norway in winter, skiing was permitted in most areas. At this, they apologised to the lady for trespassing on her land, where she then turned and left. Eventually, the remaining skiers had reached the car park and were asking why they were all standing around looking confused. The Brigadier and his companions then explained to them the drama that had just ensued, and that the elderly lady had seriously berated them for skiing on her land. Then one of the other team members asked, "What old lady?" At this point, everyone was turning their heads around, including the Brigadier and his companions, and could not see the woman anywhere. They looked down the road and believed that the woman could not have disappeared from view in that short period of time. Everyone searched the area but could find no sign of her. It was at this point that one of them suggested they must have been conversing with a ghost, especially after he described to us what she was wearing, which seemed more like clothing from around the late 19th century. Now their curiosity had been piqued, they did not jump into their cars and leave, but decided to solve the mystery. They then headed to the farmhouse in search of the elderly lady, but found that the house was occupied by a young couple and their two small children. They asked the couple whether an elderly lady was residing with them, but they replied that they did not know anyone who fitted her description. However, the young farmer did tell them that the farmhouse was once owned by his great-grandfather, who lived there with his wife, who originally came from Scotland. Unfortunately, they had no photographs from which they could identify her. The farmer did say that they were free to ski on the land whenever they wanted. So this eerie experience asked many questions, in that 3 people were witness to this ghostly encounter, or shared hallucination. The elderly woman could not have been a residual haunting, where she was enacting a scene from the past with 3 people from the past, because they were able to have a conversation with her. There is no doubt that the 3 skiers had an interaction with an elderly woman, and the question to be asked is, was their confrontation taking place in her period of time, or was she interacting in their current period of time? The Peasants' Revolt. The following incident took place in December 1942 during World War II. Mrs. B. McDougall was serving in the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, and along with 2 other colleagues had been posted to Abingdon Air Force Base, Oxfordshire, in southeast England. They arrived at Abingdon Station on their way to the base and had to start walking as they realised they had missed the transport that was to have driven them there. Along the way, they decided to rest for a few minutes under a bridge near the River Och, which was a tributary of the River Thames. All of a sudden, Mrs. McDougall found herself amongst a group of peasants who appeared to be in the middle of a revolt. She found herself squashed in the middle of a crowd of people who were hurrying under the bridge. She was now extremely hot and was feeling the heat and sweat of the people who were pressed up close to her. Their clothes were rough and very coarse, and she was absolutely terrified and her heart was beating fast. As she came out the other side of the bridge, she found herself back in her own time, where the incident appeared to have taken only a few seconds. After researching her terrifying event under the bridge, she came to the conclusion that she had been caught up in what appeared to be part of Wat Tyler peasants' revolt of the 14th century. Walter Wat Tyler was the leader of the 1381 peasants' revolt in England. He marched a group of rebels from Canterbury to London to oppose the institution of a poll tax and to demand economic and social reforms. It appears Mrs. B. McDougall had been momentarily caught up in a time slip from the 14th century that seemed to have affected only her and not her colleagues, who were totally unaware of the drama that had taken place with their comrade. Lightning strike. On a warm evening on the 28th of July 1974, Peter Williamson and his family were having a barbecue. Suddenly the weather changed for the worse with the arrival of an electrical storm. Although the family was under cover, the sound of the storm along with the lightning strike terrified their dog, who then panicked and ran into the bushes in their garden. Peter then ran into the stormy weather to retrieve their dog and somehow coax it back to the house. Whilst he was out searching for the dog, he was struck by lightning, and in front of his family, Peter Williamson vanished into thin air. The police were immediately contacted. However, no trace of Peter was found. His disappearance shocked his wife so much that she had to be put under sedation. 3 days later, at 8 a.m. in the morning, Peter suddenly reappeared and was found lying in some nearby bushes with 1 foot in the pond. He was also wearing a different pair of trousers than the ones he disappeared in. When questioned, all that Peter could remember of his 3 missing days was that he'd been lying in a hospital bed just a few miles away. He remembered the young doctor's name who treated him, being Dr. Nugent, and the patient who was in the bed next to him had kindly lent him a pair of trousers, as his trousers had somehow been damaged, quite possibly in the lightning strike. Other than those few memories, he could remember nothing else about the incident. A short time later, Peter started to have vivid dreams that over time became more and more lucid. In the dreams, he is standing in an unfamiliar garden and is soaking wet. He then walks out of the garden and wanders around the street, totally confused. He is eventually found wandering around lost and bewildered and escorted to a nearby hospital and given a series of tests. As he was lying in bed, the ward he was in was surrounded by strange, shimmery, glowing light. As his condition improved, the hospital staff allowed him to go outside into the hospital gardens. It was while he was walking around in the hospital garden that he suddenly found himself amongst the bushes with his foot in the pond. He had somehow been sent back to his proper timeline. The question that must be asked is whether any of the staff or patients at the hospital saw him suddenly disappear, just as his family had witnessed previously. As Peter recovered, he eventually found the hospital that he had been admitted to and managed to find Dr. Nugent. However, the Dr. Nugent he was now looking at was considerably older than the doctor that had treated him in the hospital whilst in his unusual dream state. When he approached the doctor, he asked him whether he remembered treating him as an amnesia victim. but the doctor replied, stating that it was impossible as he had not treated an amnesia patient for many, many years. So what happened to Peter Williamson in 1974? Did a lightning strike zap him into a time slip, sending him back into the past where he found Dr. Nugent as a young doctor? Or was Peter sent to another dimension? Fortunately for Peter, time sent him back to the present. However, other people who experienced a similar transformation but never came back, only to be trapped in another time or dimension. Thousands of people go missing around the world every year. Could they have had a similar fate? Isle of Wight, England. In June 1999, Michael and Nolene Sleep were on holiday on the Isle of Wight, an island off the south coast of England. On one particular day, the weather was warm and sunny, so they took advantage of the beautiful sunshine and decided to take a stroll down a country lane towards a park. As they were casually walking along, they came upon a large Victorian house with some children playing with a ball on the grass at the front of the property. However, they found the scene very unusual, as all the children appeared to be wearing old-fashioned clothing, where the boys wore knee breeches, which were short trousers that were fastened just below the knee. The girls were dressed in gym slips that were sleeveless belted tunics that reached from their shoulders to their knees. Although they could hear the voices of the children as they played, they could not actually make out what they were saying. Strangely though, as one of them kicked the ball, it did not seem to go anywhere. The whole scenario appeared surreal to the couple and made them feel uneasy. Nevertheless, they continued walking, but their uneasiness did not go away as they then came upon two men next to an old-fashioned vehicle. As they drew closer to the men, they then greeted them, but were totally ignored as if they were invisible. The couple then carried on walking to the park and stayed there for a couple of hours, no doubt consoling each other after their unusual encounters. After leaving the park, they returned to their accommodation along the same route, and Nolene looked across at the old house and found the children still playing with the ball. But what perturbed her was that it appeared that the children had not moved at all. She then alerted her husband, who was looking in the opposite direction, and as he turned his head, the whole scene vanished in front of them. They said it was like suddenly switching off a television. Michael and Nolene Sleep were extremely disturbed by what they had just witnessed, when Nolene said she never wanted to experience anything like it ever again. Beefeaters. In the middle of the last century, a yeoman warder, who was a servant in the royal household, was on duty in the Byward Tower in the Tower of London. On one particular occasion, he suddenly looked up and was amazed to see 5 beefeaters who appeared to be dressed in outfits from a much earlier period in time. They were seated around a log fire and smoking pipes. The room in which he was standing had somehow altered in appearance. The yeoman then walked out of the room, and a short time later, when he came back into the room, he found that everything had reverted back to normal. Had he seen ghosts? Had he experienced a residual haunting? Or had he momentarily been caught in a time slip? Physicists define time as a progression of events from the past to the present into the future. But what if the person were to experience something that challenges that scientific belief and are somehow caught up in unexpected time travel called a time slip? The horse and cart. The following time slip incident happened in the late 90s in Kings Lynn, Norfolk, UK. Jack Evans was in town with his sister and father, and they were waiting for a train that his sister was due to leave on. They had some time to kill and were standing by a fence next to the railway station. They all had a clear view of a road that leads to a roundabout just ahead. It was about midday, and they just stood around chatting until it was time to walk to the station. All of a sudden they stopped talking, and as they were casually looking down the road, the atmosphere suddenly changed. Everything went quiet, and they could no longer hear any traffic noises, and Jack said it felt as if somebody had turned the volume right down. Then the air around them seemed to change, where everything felt quiet and spooky. As this strange event was unfolding, nobody said a word until the eerie silence was suddenly broken when they heard the sounds of horses' hooves on the road. When out of nowhere, they saw a horse and cart driven by a man whose face appeared to be full of anger. He was dressed in clothing that looked like something out of the 18th century. His whole appearance and demeanour were rough and dirty, and his car looked as if it had seen better days. He proceeded to drive his cart around in circles, and at the same time he kept staring around, occasionally looking directly at them. He was a big, rough-looking man and continued with this behaviour, continuing to look angry and furious and red in the face, as if he were looking for someone to seriously hurt. They all just stood there fearing the man, as he was certainly someone they did not want to challenge. After this frightening tirade, he then turned the horse and cart around and raced off down the same road that he had come up, and they could hear the sound of a horse's hooves as they disappeared and faded into the distance. The moment they could no longer hear the sounds of the hooves, the atmosphere changed back to normal, where the traffic noises returned and they were returned to the present. Not knowing what had just happened to them, they just stared at each other, totally shaken, at the same time in disbelief at what had just occurred. Finally, one of them spoke. "Did you see that?" And the others could only reply, "Yes, we did. And what the hell was it?" It was an experience Jack would never forget, and figured they'd been caught up in some sort of time slip that terrified all three of them. The Native American. The following account does not specify where in America the incident took place, but there is no doubt that the following person experienced something he could not explain. Early one morning in 2007, John Siebel was with his dog in his front yard and was looking out over his property when he spotted what looked like a Native American Indian male. The young Indian looked to be in his early 20s and was walking along a hillside across his short yard towards the stream, but then suddenly disappeared into thin air. When he first saw the young man, he appeared to be translucent, but at the same time looked very real and alive. He had long brown hair that had been tied back behind his head. He was not wearing a headdress of any kind. He was dressed in a tan-coloured short skirt-looking dress around his waist that came down to his knees. The young man walked past his storage building in front of John and his dog, barely 60 feet from them, and he paid them no attention at all, as if he was ignoring them or could not see them. He appeared to be determined to get somewhere and appeared to be deep in thought. John thought the next time he would be prepared, and the following mornings bought a camera in the hope of capturing an image of the young man, but he never appeared again. John is uncertain whether he was seeing residual activity, a ghost, or possibly a time slip. What confused John was that the young Native American appeared so real, and yet his dog had no reaction to him. But then he said, "My dog doesn't normally react to strangers anyway," and may have accepted the young Indian as a normal person. Home and Away. The following incident took place in Australia while a young girl was watching TV. Michelle Egan was 12 years old, watching TV whilst doing her homework. She was watching an Australian soapie called Home and Away, which started at 6 p.m. She was following the story and knew who all the characters were. When the commercials came on, she went into the kitchen and was surprised that her mother had not started cooking, as they always ate at 6 p.m, and asked the mother why dinner wasn't ready, where her mother got irritated. Confused by her mother's response, she went back to watching the TV. When she sat in front of the TV, she found that The Cosby Show was now playing and was at least halfway through the episode. Well, The Cosby Show started at 5 p.m. Still not fully aware of what was happening, she looked across at her sister and said she'd just been watching a new episode of Home and Away. Her sister didn't believe her because it hadn't started yet, as it was not 6 p.m. Michelle said that she not only watched it, but could tell her what had happened in the episode. When Home and Away did come on, it was exactly as she had remembered, about 45 minutes previously. Michelle and her sister figured the mistake was made by the TV station and they had inadvertently aired the show early. However, when she arrived at school the following day, she mentioned what had happened to her friends, who had all been watching the show that evening, and all said that there'd be no error and the Cosby Show had come on at the normal time and Home and Away had started at the normal time of 6 p.m. Somehow, Michelle had been brought forward in time by 45 minutes, and that is also why her mother had not prepared dinner.